Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we are joined by the co-founders of Incident Analytics, Alex Fernando and Warren Smith, who will take us through today's session on critical controls in practice, understanding why implementation is difficult for workers. As we welcome our attendees today from across our beautiful country and beyond, Centus acknowledges the traditional custodians throughout Australia and recognises their connections to land, waters and community. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are with us today, and we do this because we value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture and knowledge. Before we kick off, while we do have everyone on mute, please share your questions, reflections and ideas in our live chat, which you can open from the bottom of your meeting window. All questions will be answered during the Q&A period at the end of the session. We will also host a poll during this session, so when you see that pop up asking you a question, please make sure to answer that as quickly as possible. And note that this session will be recorded and a recording will be available within 48 hours. And with that said and done, I'll now pass over to our fantastic partners at Incident Analytics, Alex and Warren. Take it away, gentlemen.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jasmine. Look, really appreciate you setting this up. And welcome to everyone who's joined the webinar, especially Warren. Morning.
Thank you, Alex.
Fantastic. So look, really privileged to spend a bit of time with you on this webinar. We're going to unpack some of our research findings that we've released into the market, but also just really slowly kind of unpacking things. We're really trying to understand what gets in the way of implementing controls effectively. And we're going to unpack that through sharing some data, but also just unpacking some of the insights from our research as well. And of course, would really encourage you to participate, prompt us with questions, throw some questions into the chat. I think Jasmine's already foreshadowed the mechanism through which you do that. So those of you who don't know Instant Analytics, we've been around for some years now and very much specialise in bringing data intelligence to understanding how work is done, particularly in those high hazard industries. We've partnered with Centus for some years now, and the sweet spot there is that there are systems and data-led strategies around how you enhance control effectiveness. But of course, there's a people factor, and so Centus brings, and has been quite valuable in terms of partnering with Instant Analytics to help their clients to find the intersection between how data enables better conversations, stronger leadership, and enabling culture within those high hazard environments. So in terms of what we do, we are very much data led in terms of providing clarity and shining a light on high hazard work. And our belief is that if you can learn from unplanned events and also, in some instances, triangulate how work is done, because I think they're both very complementary, it actually gives you a far more holistic picture in terms of how to better control high hazard work. So Warren and I have been founded the organisation, and we're surrounded by a bunch of people who are very much specialists in their own right. I might just throw a quick nod to Trish Karen, who brings a process safety perspective to the work we do. Don Martin, who's very well known in the SIP prevention space, based out of the US. Anthony Deacon, who's been involved in both ICMM, co-authoring ICMM, but also in his past life heading up Rio Tinto's risk management deployments, and then Liz from a educational background in terms of the work we do in the research. So I'll just quickly give you a synopsis in terms of the type of work we do, and throwing on the next slide. Really what we do is get involved in governance. Quite often organisations are saying to us, well, how do we get more confidence in terms of the data? How do we rely on the data in terms of what's reported? And so quite often we find that high potential incidents get misclassified as either negligible or in terms of the classification, and there's a spectrum of maturity around it. And so quite often we get major and moderates and minors, and so organisations from a governance perspective look to us for independent assurance around that reporting. We also get deep into control analysis, so we will look at big bodies of data or a series of high potential near misses and give organisations a perspective on what controls are either absent or ineffective, Our methodology is underpinned by an accident causation model called SCALE, and that throws a light on the analysis of those serious incidents, particularly around the high potential incidents as well. And of course, we do a bunch of work in terms of assessing controls. But I will keep moving into in terms of what we're going to cover today. And I can see a bunch of people from all around the world, really. So there's about, wow, it's quite a turnout. So look, I would highly encourage you to continue to just prod and poke questions into the chat, because I think with the cohort that's here, it should be a really rich conversation. In terms of what we're going to cover today, I'll give you an overview of our research. It's quite a big meta study that we've undertaken over several years. And then I'll invite Warren to kind of help us understand some of the insights and findings. And of course, bringing it back to, well, what do we do about this? And what's the lens through which we look at, high hazard activity? So I'll pace the conversation, and let's get cracking. So in terms of the research itself, there is, it was a meta study that was undertaken over the last 4 or 5 years, Warren, I think that's right. And it was probably the largest study that we've undertaken, at least, which spanned 12 countries, 12 industry sectors, all being very high hazard industries. So from utilities to mining, metals manufacturing, agriculture, warehousing, quite a bit of port operations, which interesting ports, Warren, that's it's almost the juncture of, commodities, rail, marine operations. So that's actually quite a sophisticated high hazard environment. So that research then led us to get a bit deeper in terms of understanding the types of incidents, and that next slide will give you a bit of a sense of what we uncovered. And so, and by the way, those of you who haven't got a copy of this, there's a link that Jasmine put in the chat. It's a series of research papers, and so what we'll cover off today is a thin slice of that. But at a meta level, what we did was we analysed over 10,000 incidents, injuries, near misses, high potentials. There's different people call the same thing different things, but effectively a lot of incidents. Sometimes there were control breaches as well. Again, interesting to see how different organisations classify those and treat those. But what we did was we did a deeper dive on those incidents to see whether we could unpack some greater insights in terms of how high hazard work is undertaken. And what we found in our first takeaway really was that only about 5,000 of those incidents was actually sufficiently documented to actually provide insights in terms of, the work that either went wrong or unplanned. And so the first takeaway is, well, if you're leveraging so much time and effort and resource to do investigations, well, try and increase, the value of those incident investigations with enough information that actually makes it useful. Out of those 5,000, what we did was we did a deep dive on the subset of those incidents that were actually, in our view, considered to be a high potential incident. So it's about 680 of those that we did a really, really deep dive. And interestingly, what we found was there were about well over 1,000 controls that were either absent or ineffective. And we're going to unpack that today. So one of the key takeaways on the next slide was that that quite often these serious incidents are inaccurately classified. And our first research paper unveiled some of the drivers for that. This paper that we are talking to in this webinar is really around trying to unpack and understand why is it that those incidents have controls that were either absent or ineffective. What's set up the worker for success or set them up for failure, so to speak, in that the design of the controls, what was the role of the organisation in setting up people for success? So were people enabled? Were they set up for success to implement those controls effectively, or what got in the way? So we're going to unpack that today. There are a series of other takeaways which we won't go into detail today, but that's part of our meta study. In fact, takeaway number 3, which is more around that human factors side of things, is more explored in our third white paper, which is something we'll throw a nod to in due course. So with that being said, I thought it might be useful, Warren, for us to anchor some of our findings. I mean, we found that there was a significant number of incidents that were considered to be easy. So the worker
Sure.
could implement the control, um, but wasn't able to, did it poorly for all sorts of reasons.
Hmm.
Um, and there was another group where the controls are actually difficult to implement. And then certain controls are actually completely unworkable. So I invite you to kind of talk to this and expand on this a bit more, was.
Sure, Alex. Yeah, it was really interesting for us when we started looking through this lens. I mean, some people who've had a lot of experience over decades, who in the audience of this webinar might remember from behaviour-based safety days, we used to talk about enable, difficult, and impossible, control situations. And Alex and I felt that this was actually a really important concept, to not assume that the controls regime that an organization mandates, for high risk work to be performed, is necessarily perfectly set up for success, for the worker. It's actually very, very difficult to account for every potential different scenario. When you do your risk assessment, you do some bow tie analysis, you develop your controls, that should be implemented that would actually protect the worker from those serious risks. And you formulate that in a risk control framework. And we look at that through the lens of this easy, difficult, and unworkable, because the data kept on throwing up some really interesting aspects about why people would not necessarily be implementing the control as designed or as mandated. And we were interested to see whether or not the situation was a contributing factor to that, and often it was. So where we'd say that the work is easy to perform, it should be easy to perform. The control was available for the worker. There's a whole raft of different reasons why a worker might not. This is usually slip lapse territory, or just making a mistake. The intention's usually positive, just doesn't happen the way it's meant to happen. With the difficult ones, we found a lot more, kind of interesting situations there where, the worker, due to a situational or an exceptional circumstance, felt that they couldn't implement the control. It was possible, but it would have been difficult to do it by the book. And therefore, the worker is going to get a little bit creative about how they do that because they're still driven to get the job done. And I think, there's always, generally speaking, there's going to be a positive intent here. The question is that creativity that's employed to get the job done, how much extra risk is actually involved? The last the last option, which is the unworkable, this is where really the control simply isn't available or could never be implemented in that particular circumstance. They're fewer, but they still happen, and shortly we'll talk about the percentages of those. But just to use a confined space example, Alex, just to bring it to life a little, you can imagine, if I'm working in a confined space situation, and this is a classic slip lapse, kind of situation where, workers assume the colleagues gone and done the atmospheric testing, they've gone into the confined space or into the vessel, and really, in actual fact, there's been no verification done at all. So a series of assumptions have been made. Those are incorrect assumptions. We've got a situation where the verification could easily have been done. It just wasn't. In the second one, we've got an issue here where the worker is trying to do it, but in actual fact, they probably don't quite have the skill or experience or knowledge in how to do it properly. So we have a situation there where we're putting a worker into a difficult high-risk context where a control should be implemented, doesn't get implemented because that worker hasn't really been set up for success. They've been deployed into that role with inadequate experience. We would say from the worker's perspective, that control situation is actually difficult, not impossible, but difficult. The last one is tricky here because we've actually got a tool or a piece of equipment that just doesn't work. And it's if it hasn't been calibrated, or the calibration process is actually inaccurate. And in this situation, we would say that really that's actually an unworkable control in that particular context. Now, the question, of course, is how much of these different situations tend to occur with those 1,000+ control failures. And I think the next slide, Alex, this really probably is a bit of a surprise for some people, that more than a third of the control failures in those SIF potential incidents would have been difficult or unworkable in our estimation when we've actually had a good hard look at the incident context. and the availability of controls when we actually read the incident investigation, we're seeing that way too many of them would have been difficult for the worker in those situations. So more than a third, we can't say that more than a third necessarily of controls are difficult to implement in general across all tasks, but these are situations where an incident has occurred, and that's the lens we're looking through here.
Yeah. And look, what was interesting about this, that lens that you took with easy, difficult, unworkable is I look at it as being, we've got workers imagined, the assumptions we make around how people are expected to put in controls, but then also assumptions about, how work is done in the field. And of course, you can take two lenses, and we would encourage you to take two lenses around, well, how do you learn in terms of incidents that were eventful from a historical perspective, but then also pairing that with verifying controls in the field and taking a similar kind of lens in terms of, are people set up for success to implement those controls? And we'll talk about that in a second. But before we unpack that a bit further, I think, Jasmine, if we could just extend a poll out there. And the question we're trying to prompt here is, what do you feel in your experience, either in the current organisation, or if you're a consultant in the work you support other organisations, or in a past life, what do you feel are the key drivers of things that get in the way for workers implementing controls? So is the control hard to use? Is it difficult to put in place or awkward in practice? Is the local work environment not conducive to implementing controls? Are other factors getting in the way? Warren talked about slip lapses and mistakes. That could be compounded by fatigue or stress or mental distraction, leading to skipping steps. But of course, there might be other organisational pressures like slowing the job down, the production versus doing things in a kind of measured manner. But of course, there might be worker knowledge that might get in the way. People aren't set up for success from that perspective, or workers, and rightly so, feel that those certain controls aren't appropriate given the circumstance. Obviously, we have humans in certain roles doing things for a good reason. And if there's other kind of thoughts that come to mind, please throw it in the chat as well. So I can't see the poll at this stage, but I'm assuming there's a horse race.
We'll give everyone just another couple of seconds to answer, and then we'll close the poll and show the results.
Fantastic.
And
thank you,
5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. There we go. There's our results.
Well, there you go. What are your thoughts, Warren? Looks like fear of slowing down the job, holding things up, is the most predominant driver. Well, that's closely associated. Workers think controls aren't needed in some situations.
It's a very good spread, Alex. Yeah, and I'm seeing some of the comments in the chat as well. That people are sort of fleshing out some of their ideas there.
Workers are informed of why behind the control, unable to attach or connect to the needed control.
Yeah.
Controls aren't available, lack consultation with the workers. So yeah, there's quite a mix of people's experiences here.
So many experienced workers who've been doing a task for a long, long time. They will usually work out the best way, for them to do it in the most efficient manner. And that often means that it doesn't necessarily perfectly reflect, what's written down in on the control checklist. And if we're not out there verifying, on a regular basis and having a conversation about that and trying to tease out, well, in actual fact, is that way that you do this task actually a better way than what's been mandated? Because sometimes that is the case. But if we're never having conversations about it, we're never going to find out.
Absolutely. So let's dig into a bit of the research in terms of the data and uncover what that's telling us. So I'll throw to you on this, Warren. Do you want to
surely. Look, it was really interesting that when we looked at the relatively easy control situations, where the worker really could reasonably be expected to do what is required in the manner that's kind of mandated. We found that more than 3/4 of those easy control situations they resulted from slip, lapse, or mistake, where it's the unintended error situation. And slip, lapses, and mistakes are a little bit different, but fundamentally, we've got somebody who's intending to do it, by the book, for want of a better word. And just somehow it just goes wrong through, skipping a step, forgetting something, thinking they're doing it the right way, but it turns out the wrong way, for that particular situation. Interesting with the difficult ones, we found that nearly 70% of those, and this is probably intuitively, the right response, is that you find people still wanting to get the job done. So in that situation, they're becoming, creative in the way they actually assess the risk and treat that risk in their own way. And it could be because of situational or exceptional situation, or context. Like you seriously can't legislate for every single operating context, whether it be work at height, whether it be confined space. It doesn't matter what it is. We do our best when we do our bow tie analysis and we work out what our controls need to be. But in fact, and even when you've got the best workers in the room, doing that process, you still can't legislate for every single context. So interesting with the unworkable, even more of those unworkable control situations resulted in often a more risky approach to the work, where people would take a shortcut, or they would actually feel like they actually had to adjust the situation in a way that probably elevated the risk a little bit. So
Yeah, look,
just go on, Alex.
yeah, no, look, I think what was interesting here is that obviously this is across our entire data set. The 5,000 and then the 680 deep dive incidents. But of course, the important thing to note is that you can't use that blanket kind of percentage and say, well, all work is kind of similar kind of proportions. What we found was when we cut the data was that there were nuances from one high risk activity to the other. So let's unpack that in the next slide.
Sure.
And here's a good example of where, when you look at it from a high risk activity like motor vehicle related or suspended load or falling objects, for example, there's different proportions of easy, difficult, and unworkable. So what were your thoughts on this one, Warren?
Yes, it's interesting where the controls are far more behaviourally focused, and motor vehicle operation is a classic for that, because most of the key controls when it comes to motor vehicle operation to avoid loss of control or collision or impact on kind of pedestrian and so forth. Most of those controls are actually down to sort of very fine-tuned judgment, by and skill and competence behind the steering wheel. Braking smoothly, scanning your environment around you, on a regular basis. Making sure you keep appropriate safe distance, from vehicles in front of you. They're all very, very much behavioural judgment, related kind of control situations. Yes, there's mechanical integrity there, and there's a range of issues that tend to drive the difficult or unworkable, and they are mostly about mechanical integrity, where the vehicle itself, was the problem, in a way that the driver couldn't have really been responsible for testing out before they started their journey. When you lose a wheel, for instance, out in the outback, there's a lot of regional operations where dust between brake discs and and the way that the wheel is actually bolted onto the to produces that, then you hope that you've got a good control regime that sits upstream of that situation, where I've got more confidence that when I step into that vehicle, I'm not going to have a problem. But we know, whilst we're saying that's a very enabled set of controls for drivers, we know also that it's actually, unfortunately, a set of controls that are highly unreliable, because human error is going to be absolutely, kind of one of those issues that we find most difficult to manage. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got things like hazardous substance exposure, and it's really interesting that came up so difficult and unworkable in terms of the controls around that. And most of that was around loss of containment, in an organisational kind of system sense. It wasn't actually the operator behaviour or the worker behaviour that was driving any of that. But where hazardous substance exposure, we've got PPE, problems, inappropriate PPE, for instance, PPE that just would never have actually protected the worker in those situations.
Right.
We've got, mechanical integrity issues. We've got loss of containment, where years and years of poor maintenance have actually allowed that situation to exist. So very, very different context for that compared to uncontrolled release of energy, where it's more about weak isolation or complex, isolation matrices that are really difficult to deploy. A little bit of mechanical integrity there, but much, much better enabled than say hazardous substance exposure. Often we see people queried us around contact with electricity, like how on earth can contact with electricity, which is such a high profile risk, have such a difficult and non-enabled, kind of context around controls. And we found that, that most of those were actually not electrical technicians. These were events that happened to workers who just happened to be unfortunately exposed, to contact with electricity, who really should never have been exposed in the first place. From a past event where poor maintenance had occurred, or no maintenance had occurred on something that should have actually been addressed, sometime in the past. So in actual fact, it's probably fairly well controlled. We know isolations get done fairly well. But you've still got to be really careful about workers who actually have no understanding about electricity, who may come into contact with it. Relatively small number of incidents though, Alex, and I haven't shown that here. This is just simply the spread of enabled, easy, difficult and unworkable for each risk.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm just noticing the chat, and I'll be absolutely interested in people's view on how you interpret this data and what their experience is relative to this. And I think a couple of comments in particular are that different risks have different control profiles, and I'm thinking that might even be, I think, to your earlier point around contact with electricity. Some risks have higher, there's more light shone on those particular risks. So more regulation, more incidents historically, tighter guidance from regulators. So that there are a bunch of risks here that probably fall into that category where there's greater oversight and monitoring, if you like, and greater consultation with the workforce. That kind of comes to mind. Obviously, there's no way of kind of validating those hypotheses, but there's some interesting perspectives, Warren, coming through the chat here. Some
I should
controls.
say, Alex, just work at height and falling object is a really classic, kind of situation, because it's very similar. In fact, some organisations jam those two, like risk categories together. So they actually frame their control architecture around one risk, and of course they're quite different. And you can see here, the difficult and unworkable context for falling object is quite different to work at height. And work at height is exactly as you describe. It's a very high profile risk that gets a lot of attention. It probably gets a lot of verification being performed in the field as well. It's very easy for us to notice somebody working at height, and we tend to be fairly highly attuned to what we expect to see: harnesses, scaffolds set up appropriately, people operating, with fairly tightly controlled spaces. Whereas falling object, not so much. We see people very vague about what barricading should look like, what drop zones, how they should be structured. Toe boards on scaffolds often missing because people just don't think through the risk of things dropping, from height. So quite different contexts.
Well, that's a good segue to the next slide, because I think what might be useful is to dive into a bit more detail into those specific risk categories. So, to your point, gravity related, falling object, working in high suspended load, that they're all part of the same risk, if you like. But of course, different organisations in our data manage the implementation of those controls differently, or at least workers experience the implementation of those controls differently. So let's unpack this a bit further. I mean, you started talking to this already.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I jumped the gun a bit, but falling objects is really interesting because there's a lot of different ways that falling object risks can manifest. You could have something that like things that are actually sitting on a forklift tine, at significant height, and being moved around fairly quickly. Falling objects in that context, particularly when you have pedestrians in the same space, as like load moving equipment, that's often quite a significant risk that doesn't it doesn't get anywhere near as well controlled, for instance, as more static situations where you actually have, somebody, standing on a scaffold, who's doing some close work in a tight environment. So, in that situation, we see stacked material management being an issue. Certainly, the way in which stacked material is actually managed often came up as a fairly significant point of failure. Whether people who are actually not performing the same task, but they're actually co-located in the same area. We see those risks, the risks of work segregation or poor segregation at work, really coming to the fore when it came to falling object. Flooring integrity is interesting, and this is not just scaffolds, but it's walkways that have just simply got kind of a missing piece of metal, and people falling through, walkways that are actually elevated.
Right.
Quite remarkable how often that actually happens. And then, of course, you've got things like securement device, people actually losing hammers off belts, or tools that are actually quite heavy. Imagine a sort of a half kilo shifter, that's not tethered properly and lands,
right.
40 feet below. It's got some pretty serious force. Often these events, interestingly enough, didn't get rated as particularly high potential, Alex, as well, because the question about, is there serious potential risk here? Difficult for people to judge when they haven't got a sense of what, weight, momentum, speed, what it means in terms of actual risk to somebody below. And often we hear the classic responses, "Oh, nobody ever comes around here. Like nobody's allowed in this particular space." And when we really challenge that and ask, does anybody ever go into this particular space inside this barricade? And of course, the answer is usually, well, actually, yes. So working at height, different. We've got open edge protection, which is, quite a significant issue. We see people that are working on top of buildings, for instance, within 2 meters of an edge, and they're not actually restrained, with a solid anchor point. And in that particular context, once again, the worker themselves probably feel quite safe, especially if they've done that job many times. But if you don't have a solid anchor point to even latch onto, then what's the worker going to do? Well, they're going to operate without one. And that's another classic situation of a difficult control situation. Suspended load was more about competence, Alex. In that situation, we found that by far and away the most frequent issue was people not actually having enough training or education in how to manage themselves within a suspended load environment. Sure, a little bit of low weight monitoring, usually that's a mechanical integrity issue where the monitoring device simply wasn't working or calibrated properly, but mostly about lifting team confidence.
Right. And so one of my takeaways from this data is that obviously grouping falling objects of working height is tricky because you don't get that granular understanding of how well the control architecture actually works for one over the other. Suspended load tends to be, in my experience, categorized on its own as a standalone. Crane operations, suspended loads tend to be better managed from a control design perspective. But yeah, working heights and falling object, we'd advocate to kind of separate them out from an analysis perspective. And if you need to kind of integrate them back from a communication, then so be it. But let's move on to the next one, which is uncontrolled energy. So a lot of organizations in this high risk kind of context may have, blasting equipment. They use, hydraulic pressure. You might be exposed to hydraulic pressure. They might have high pressure piping, et cetera, et cetera. So it'd be good to just unpack this a bit further, Warren, because there's obviously a mixed bag of different types of uncontrolled energy that we found in our incidents.
By far and away, this one, I think I might have mentioned this before. Mechanical integrity, maintenance, having confidence that the equipment we're using, is 100% fit for purpose, and whether it be the vessel, the piping, or the joins, or the blasting equipment that we're actually using in our hands, we've found that was by far and away the most frequent point of failure. Now in some cases you would expect perhaps a pre-task inspection to have picked up some of those problems. And in that case, we would say, well, in fact, if that's the key control, a key control as a last barrier, to failure, is the worker themselves doing a really solid inspection of their equipment. You would say, well, that should be an easy control situation, that has simply just not been implemented. And we know, though, that when we're relying upon a purely behavioural control as our last line of defence, we know that's actually probably quite unreliable. So what we would expect to see, in actual fact, in order to fail safely, is we would expect to see the maintenance regime around those tools and equipment that are involved that have high energy stored within them. We'd expect that to actually be pretty robust, and that's where most of the failures occurred. Is the failure in maintenance over time, and therefore for the worker in that unfortunate situation when the incident happens, is that they're often completely surprised by whatever the failure is. Even if they've done an inspection, they probably can't be expected to actually inspect every aspect, particularly when it comes to things like metal, and like large objects that have got, you need very, very technical kind of inspection processes to uncover problems. Equipment usage was a fairly significant issue as well, and most of that that landed in the difficult or unworkable territory was where I really probably hadn't had the training, as the worker. Or I've been buddied up with somebody who actually took their eye off the ball, and that buddy was supposed to actually be teaching me or making sure that I'm doing it properly. And then we find that there are way too many assumptions about how easy the task is, and often these tasks actually aren't that easy. The usage method was a problem associated with inappropriate allocation of work to a worker who probably wasn't trained appropriately. PPE, it's surprising that PPE would come up, but it did quite often, Alex. And the suitability of PPE here, this is where a worker's actually more often than not actually using the PPE that's actually mandated and made available, but it's just poor quality PPE that doesn't actually really truly address, the nature of the risk. Like the number of times, there's PPE that actually is fit for purpose, where it actually will protect you from the particular hazard involved. Like not too many things are actually going to stop a 9-inch grinder from cutting through a glove, but there are many others, where there are less dramatic, situations. Where we'd expect the PPE to do its job properly,
Sure.
And in these cases, it didn't. So yeah.
Yeah. So what came through to me when we looked at this data a while back now is that not all controls are equal, and so you've got a particular, controls have a role to play in terms of prevention, mitigation, response, but then of course the way they're implemented, the reliability of those controls in actual practice does vary, right? So I think you've alluded to certain controls are actually appropriate, they're fit for purpose. So I think of gaiters when we go hiking, bushwalking. Apart from scanning ahead of you where you're walking and things like that, gaiters are actually quite an important PPE, if you like. But in some instances, the type of control, if it's heavily reliant on a human doing the right thing at the right time, at the right moment, sometimes there are different controls that we need to be considering. And I think this is what we foreshadowed in terms of when we looked at the next white paper, that not all controls are equal. And so looking at controls in a very particular lens is really important. So I think we've got time to jump into the motor vehicle one. Please feel free as you're progressing here to drop in your comments or even questions that we can unpack a bit further for us. Warren, vehicle movement is actually quite a different risk, in that it's a very high reliance on human behaviour in the absence of technology to help you fail safely. Let's unpack this a bit further.
Yeah, the big one here, Alex, and this is where this whole notion of easy control becomes it's a challenging concept, because whilst we might say it's an easy control, for me to be focused 100% of the time on maintaining a safe distance in heavy traffic, that's probably a fairly it's a fairly ambitious goal, for me to have a 100%, attentiveness, to and scanning my environment, on a constant basis. Now, obviously there are some people that do that better than others, but if I'm driving a truck for a living, or I'm in traffic a lot, or it could be on a mine site, with responsibility, for a light vehicle, and I've got to be having my wits about me with all these haul trucks around me. Well, we know how often haul trucks, unfortunately, tend to run over light trucks, in the mining context. So much of this is down to the worker being, or the operator of the vehicle, being completely aware, on their game, able to react to a surprising situation or a surprising hazard, with complete control over braking, steering, not doing anything with sharp movements, etc. Now, all of this, there's a skill and there's a reaction time issue. So none of this is actually really easy. So whilst it's actually got the largest easy control component, we know in reality, from an organisational context, it's not, because what we're doing is we're relying upon zero human error. And of course, nobody in the audience of this webinar would think for a second here that we can create that context of zero human error. It's just not going to happen. So the question is then, what can we do to reduce, our reliance upon, the perfect, robotic human behavior? Well, for starters, you've actually got to make sure the vehicle's maintained, because mechanical integrity was our second or third highest. 25 or 30% of vehicle incidents had some form of mechanical integrity or mechanical failure issue that the driver could probably never have foreseen, with pre-journey inspection and the rest of it. So there is an issue there. There's an easy low-hanging fruit when it comes to motor vehicle-related incidents, is to, absolutely hone in on whether or not your maintenance regime around your vehicle fleet, is producing any kinds of issues that sort of move beyond a reasonable tolerance of mechanical failure. But certainly your fatigue management programs are absolutely critical as well. If you don't have a fatigue management program, or if you're suspicious your fatigue management program doesn't actually really address the level of risk that exists, then that is a really important area, because we know how much that compounds the problem of human error in the field.
Yeah, definitely amplifies those slip, slaps, and mistakes, right?
Yeah, I'd say that the biggest one of all, and this is the thing that just doesn't happen in with organisations that have got really high exposure, to on-road vehicle risks. So a lot of operators on the road, public roads, even interior roads for that matter, but mostly public roads where it's much less controlled, is the actual skill and competence of a driver to handle a hard brake, hard steer situation. We don't teach people how to do that. And, probably the most significant, like at the point of actual failure, the most significant, kind of behavioral challenge that we see just before a collision is a hard brake, hard steer, where the vehicle loses whatever control was available to the driver in that moment. And we're not suggesting that people need to become Michael Schumacher, and have the skills of a racing car driver, but there are ways to actually improve a driver's defensive driving ability, and not just defensive driving, but also how to handle a panic stop or a panic situation, with less dramatic, handling of the controls. We know that most trucks tend to roll over because of an excessive steering input. An excessive steering input comes from a fairly panicked reaction, to a situation. That doesn't have to happen that way. It could happen more effectively if that driver had greater skill in that context.
Yeah, and look, what you've reminded me of is back in the old days in offshore oil and gas, you look at IAM training, it's really around leaders and teams in those emergency moments being it's about decision making under duress and stress, right? So that's the value of emergency response training and emergency management protocols and drills and things like that. But I think what you've alluded to here is that certain high risk activities where the controls are highly reliant on the human making a decision in that moment, equipping them with the best ability to fail safely is obviously pretty important, right?
Yeah, and look, I'd add, Alex, too, that we see a lot of technology in vehicles these days, like IVMS, for instance, and we see it being used very poorly. Like we don't see it being used constructively necessarily in every organisation. So, where it's being used as an after the incident, kind of like checking process, like it's kind of like, can we pin the blame for this event on the driver, as distinct from, or to what degree can we? And that is a very poor use of the technology, when really you've got this wonderful proactive opportunity to coach and mentor drivers based on feedback on how they're actually performing on the road. When there's no incident happening, when there's no incident happening, that's actually when you want to be, kind of using that information to help them get even better. And get in front of the risk of that event occurring. The other thing is, of course, that collision avoidance systems. If anybody's got any involvement in fleet management, you really, in this day and age, we should be selecting vehicles based on their hardwired safety technology. And collision avoidance systems at the moment are actually really sophisticated when they exist in vehicles, and they can do a great job in terms of helping to compensate or helping that driver to fail safely when probably stretching the boundaries on their ability to be able to react quickly, to that emergency situation.
Absolutely. And look, I love the comment that's come through around emphasising the weight of human-centred design of controls. And really what we've done with the subsequent white paper is actually try and find those disparate differences between controls that are more reliant on human reliability as distinct from those that are a bit more upstream. Some fantastic comments there. So I think this is really important, though. I think we talked about the predictive nature of looking at incidents historically does shine a light on the vulnerability of certain controls. But of course, you do want to try to, as best you can, triangulate that with how work is done in the 99% of the time where work doesn't go wrong. It's still within that risk envelope. But of course, there's valuable learning in terms of understanding how work is done. So let's talk to this, Warren. I think control verification data is actually really, really complementary.
Yes, and it was a very interesting little bit of side research that I was able to do on what control verification data usually produces on a sector by sector basis. And we'd expect construction, for instance, to have a fairly high non-conformance rate, because it's such a dynamic, and somewhat more difficult to control environment. And certainly the construction industry has had its challenges over the last few decades, and still does, in that space, in terms of trying to make sure that all of the fairly complex controls that workers need to deploy in a construction setting, and that's for the general public as well, are actually in place in the right way at the right time. But they tend to, even if we take sort of like an average construction firm, if when control verifications be done independently, not an in-house control verification, but an independent verification process of those controls being implemented, it's a pretty high non-conformance rate, 40%, which is, might surprise quite a few people. What we see is that mining and resources is better, but not that much better, and sure, highly mature and, very, organizations that have got very strong safety cultures, and they've actually, spent a lot of time and money and effort, building, a highly controlled and safe work culture. They tend to do it a bit better. It's down around 15%. But this is the legitimate and kind of like the honest perspective about how consistently controls are implemented in the field as designed. And it's not it's nowhere near, even in a high reliability organization, it's not 100%. And what's the point of this? The point is that if you're not out in the field asking proactive questions about why, rather than being out there with the intent of being Mr. Policeman, and try to find, what we call, in control verification terminology, they're called reds. And you want as few red, situations as possible. In fact, for us, they're a gift. Alex and I see them as a gift, because what it's telling you is that the workers somehow either find the control difficult to implement, or they think there's actually a better way to perform the task that provides them reasonable security around risk management, but they get the job done more effectively and more efficiently. Now, who am I to bowl up to these people and, try and dong them on the head for not doing it the right way, when in actual fact, they've got probably a very legitimate response to the question about why, and we should be asking why. And is this good reason for us to think about reframing our idea about what the right kind of control situation is for this task? Sometimes we find out in actual fact that the work is not properly controlled at all when we really ask the right questions. And in fact, additional or different controls are actually necessary, if we actually talk to frontline workers about it.
Yeah, great. And it's clearly complementary, learning from the unplanned events in terms of stiff exposure or exposure to serious injury fatality. But then also, if you're looking at this data here, it actually aligns pretty well, Warren. So it's interesting that this research has strengthened our perspective on how you leverage the data. So let's wrap it up. And I think what I'll do is just focus on our key takeaways, right? So clearly, what we're advocating for is that what you imagine is not necessarily as easy to implement in the field in practice. So looking at your incident data to understand, well, what's got in the way of implementing those controls? Was it easy? Was it difficult? Was it unworkable? And that's a really useful lens to really understand how effective those controls are as imagined versus how they're implemented in the field. Clearly, we use a accident causation method that really shines a light on controls that are either absent or ineffective. And what we found in terms of the research was that that lens significantly enhances your investigation methodology. So whatever methodology that you've got, or even using our scale methodology, it really shifts the focus from, from focusing on, at the pointy end of the incident to being, well, actually, how do we strengthen the control in the way it's designed on paper, but also in terms of what we can do to make it more effective in the field. So Warren talked about control verification. So clearly complementing your accident causation investigation and learning process with more focus on how do you verify controls, are people set up for success, and use it as a learning opportunity rather than a compliance activity. And far too often we found in our client base that there's more and more increased orientation towards using investigations in a more effective manner. But control verification tends to be fairly, there's quite a spectrum of maturity around using it to triangulate that data and get a really good sense of your risk profile. But of course, we're also talking about fostering a learning culture. So equally looking at how work was done and pear-shaped, but then also looking at, well, how do we learn from how work is done? So using a verification process to draw and tease that out is really important.
Alex, can I just respond to?
Yeah, please.
So, Corinne, thanks for that question. What kind of critical controls tend to fail the most frequently? They're usually not engineered controls. Engineered controls, they're usually exposure triggered controls where when exposure goes up, they automatically come into play. They just require a bit of maintenance to make sure they work. Or permanent controls, where you've got like physical controls where you've got like a barrier between pedestrians and forklifts, where we're actually separating the vulnerable from the potential force. The ones that tend to fail most frequently, of course, are those where we've actually said, well, we want Johnny, the worker, to actually either use this piece of equipment, with his own judgment, and apply that judgment and skill, to the situation in a particular way, where it suddenly, it starts to become a little fuzzier about what the performance requirements are about that task, and where the performance requirements are really, much fuzzier, is where we have a purely procedural control, where it's, could you stand over there, please, out of the line of fire? And, so my judgment about what's standing over there out of the line of fire looks like is going to be different to Alex's. And if we aren't really specific about it, and if we don't account for the potential for me actually making a misjudgment, this is when we get into trouble. So procedural or / administrative controls, they are easily the most likely, to fail. And I think most people would intuitively get that. Question is, what's the backup control that sits behind that allows us to compensate or mitigate the possibility of that administrative control failing? And this is where, if you do really good bow tie analysis, you actually analyze for that and you make sure that you've got those other barriers in place. But often we find that there's big gaps in control architectures for a lot of organizations with some risks.
And so that's probably a good segue to the next slide. We've unpacked, and there's a comment here actually from Corinne again around are certain rules or layers of rules kind of masked or disguised as controls. It's a really nice comment or insight. So we've gone to town on unpacking the various spectrums of the design intent of controls, but then also how vulnerable they are to human error, if you like, or human reliability. And of course, there's a spectrum there, and sometimes those controls are actually suitably appropriate, and other times they're actually far more vulnerable. And there's things that we can do in organizations to strengthen those controls, or at least shine a light in terms of the vulnerability of those controls. And so this white paper, feel free to download it from the website. There's a QR code here as well. And there is an associated webinar that kind of unpacks the data in a bit more detail. And I'll throw to you, Jasmine, for the next one. So Jazz, if you're talking, you may be on mute.
Hey guys, so as we know, in order to be able to drive any of the changes from the information we've learned today, we need to have a psychosocially safe workplace to do so. We have an upcoming program called the Foundations of Psychosocial Safety Masterclass, which is a 4-week blended learning program. It includes some self-paced e-learning modules that you complete in your own time, followed by a live 1-hour session each week for 4 weeks, hosted by Dr. Vanessa Cook. This will cover off understanding psychosocial safety, what it means to have respectful behaviour and own our influence, how to break bias and ignite inclusivity, as well as making sure that we have an environment that is safe to speak up and provide feedback for productive conflict. It's a fantastic program, and if you check the chat, we actually have a 10% discount code for everyone who has joined this webinar. So I encourage you, if you have the opportunity to join, it is a fantastic masterclass that really helps make a difference in how you can role model positive safety changes in your workplace.
Yeah, fantastic.
And now we're going to jump into our Q&A, and I'm looking at the chat, and one of the questions that we've got in, gentlemen, was from Christian. Christian's question is, did the study consider the change management element with relation to uncontrolled energy release, specifically as a contributing factor to a control implementation challenge, as a control may be rendered inactive or ineffective if a change is not considered properly? In Christian's experience, it's the most forgotten part of the process. So how would you reply to that, gentlemen?
Well, sorry, can I jump in, Alex?
Yeah, go for it.
Just to completely and totally support what Christian's saying here, management of change was an organisational factor, because what we effectively do is we do a sort of a reanalysis of these incidents, based on the information we've got sitting in front of us. Management of change came up far too frequently when it came to uncontrolled release of energy. And this is exactly as you described. We see that new equipment is brought on board, or new procedures or processes are put in place without necessarily considering the entire chain of activity. So then we find that, in fact, the procedure actually has had no update to its to the control environment. But in fact, we've got completely new equipment. In some cases, we've got a new procedure, but no contextualizing of that from a risk management perspective. So you're absolutely, look, it doesn't happen that often, thank heavens, but it was a bit all too frequent within that particular category. So thank you for that question. It's an excellent one.
We have time for one more question, and this question also comes from Corinne. The question is, how do we as safety professionals emphasize the weight of human-centered design of controls, human-centered design of work systems, etc., for the industry, rather than continue to layer upon layer of rules that are masked as controls?
I'll throw to you, Alex, because I talk too much.
Yeah, no, all good. Look, it's a great comment. I think I padded onto it earlier on. I think there's definitely the opportunity to have a more human-centered approach to designer controls, but I think also inevitably what happens is these controls are imagined and they're implemented in a particular way, and they're far too reliant on humans doing the right thing at the right time. I think to your point, controls masters rules does come up quite a lot when we look at control architectures, and and not all controls are the same, and nor are they designed with the same level of integrity and reliability. And so I think you've got a really good point. And what I said before was that in our subsequent research, we've unpacked that exact question in a lot more detail, Corinne. So I think I encourage you to have a look at that paper and download it, and also jump into the next webinar as well. And what did you want to add to that? Was anything?
I would just say absolutely. If you think about the ICMM consideration about the different types of controls, there's object, there's act and object, and there's act. I think things that are pure acts, I don't know that they can actually be seriously considered as actual controls. We in fact, I'm moving more toward philosophically over time, Alex, the idea that we actually have to be far more defined about what we consider to be an actual control, rather than treating a person behavior as a control. The controls need to be supportive of the worker who is never going to get this particular behavior right every time. The controls need to sit upstream with that and make sure that failing safely is possible. And look, many people have used that language, Todd Conklin and others. And I think it's actually it's the right idea around how do we frame what controls actually are.
Fantastic. Excellent, Jasmine.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. A couple of final reminders for everyone. When the webinar wraps up, you will be presented with a short survey on your screen. We'd greatly appreciate if you could take 2 minutes to provide your feedback on today's session. And just in case there's anything you want to go over again or you want to share with your colleagues, you will receive a link to the session recording within the next 48 hours. That concludes our webinar for the day. Massive thank you to our friends Alex and Warren from Incident Analytics for taking us through today's session, and thank you to everybody for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Have a great day all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine. Thank you, everyone.